Hello, and this is Derick Varn, and welcome to Theorizing with a Hammer, where we smash the idols in your head here on the Zero Books channel. Now, I was going to finish my story of the development of critical theory in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, particularly through the history of the Frankfurt School in America. We're going to come back to that eventually. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, we're going to have to talk about something else, and maybe quite a few other things. This is January 17th, 2021, and on January 6th, 2021, there was the White House attack. I am calling it an attack to avoid the implications. I'm calling it an insurrection, or a coup, or whatever else, because it was in some ways all of those things, and maybe also none of them. Definitely there are elements of trying to subvert a democratic election by people who were led to believe that democratic election was illegitimate. But that's not actually what I am talking about today, although it's directly tied to it. And it's also directly tied to why people identify with political personalities more than holding people accountable for their actual politics. And believe it or not, one of the best explanations for this is from media theory and psychology, and that is the parasocial interaction scale and parasocial relationships. Now, you probably have heard about parasocial relationships recently. Streaming and social media have made this more intense, and particularly since so many people have been isolated during COVID, parasocial relationships have become intensified, meaning that people are having more and more relationships where they think they have an interaction with an individual as a media personality or as a live streamer or like with me on a YouTube channel. But parasocial interactions are one-sided. It used to be that our parasocial interactions were largely with ideas that we would invest a lot of time into. And so we had the beginnings of people who study parasocial interactions will tell you we had the beginnings of this with media figures and pre even mass media. So people would have parasocial interactions with their conception of a religious figure or with a king that they never interacted with but had images of and rumors about in their life all the time. Now, a parasocial interaction is an illusionary experience where you interact with a persona or a figure in a way where you have intimacy about them, but they don't have intimacy about you. And it's been studied since the mid-1950s. In fact, the term was coined by Donald Horton and Richard Roll in 1956 about the beginnings of people feeling relationships to TV announcers and figures in television media in specific, and also in radio. Media users have loyalty and feel direct connection to personas, which are often created, are entirely fictional. Now, since the 60s, this has also been expanded more and more into politics. While there's always been a parasocial element to the way people interact with political figures, otherwise things like, in the age of mass politics in the beginning of the 20th century, things like the coast of personality wouldn't have worked. But the extent of it has greatly increased, as is an ability for more and more people within the governmental sphere to try to use parasocial relationships in lieu of actual relationships. And Trump supporters, as well as, frankly, as supporters of the Squad, are often in parasocial relationships where they project a mutuality. Now, I bring up the Squad because we often expect the Squad to do, for example, the left's bidding. But if we remember, the Squad is for Congress people who have specific constituents and specific constituent concerns. And yes, they do have a left-wing ideology, and well, at least in blue and relative to the Democratic Party. But they often don't keep their promises to the larger public mass, and maybe not even to their constituents. The investment since Donald Trump has been to use Twitter, which is a parasocial interaction generator par excellence, because it is very easy to feel like you're having an interaction with someone on Twitter, given that it is unguarded and you can comment to them, but they might not even see your post. The number of people who comment on, for example, one tweet by me, I often realize that I don't see them if I don't follow them back. That is a parasocial generator like few have ever seen. Politicians can use parasocial interaction to do a lot of things. And let's talk about what parasocial actions can be used for. Psychologists have shown, don't you love when people say psychologists have shown? But psychologists since the 1980s have really invested in parasocial interactions and seen that it is particularly important for people who are isolated. So in prior times, the elderly, although in COVID times, it's everybody, and the young. And because the relationships are not reciprocal, actually they feel in some ways more validating and less anxiety producing, because there's no way for the character, the persona, the politician to reject you because they don't really have a relationship with you in the first place. Your intimacy with them is one-sided and thus not at risk by any social interaction or cue. This has increased over the internet exponentially, and this has been studied. The other thing that we can find is while parasocial interactions have positive, consequences for children, such as positive identity formation and the ability to learn. Now, part of my job outside working for Zero Books is to work in education, and one of the best predictors of a student learning from a teacher is to have a positive social relationship with that teacher. In fact, it's one of the things that has one of the highest things on these things called the Hattie's effect ratios, where the more likely you are to have a positive perception and a positive relationship with a teacher, to think a teacher cares about you, the more likely you are to take their direct instruction, and the more likely you are for that direct instruction to stick. So you can use what we call parasocial interaction scales to help people develop positive learning through the media and to develop their identity. However, that identity formation element has a flip side. Over-identification with a figure can lead to terror management theory beginning to apply. So if I highly identify with Donald Trump, or if I highly identify with AOC, my identity is at risk when they do things that do not fit my projection upon them. So I will either defend them, even when it's not in my interest to do so, or I will create elaborate stories for why they cannot do what I imagine they should do. Now you can see how this is easily manipulatable in politics, and it's kind of a way of gaslighting yourself. You identify your identity, and thus even your existence in this world in many ways, to a person to which you see yourself as having a relationship through media exposure or through knowing intimate bits about their life that they put out to the entire world through social media, and yet they have no real formal relationship to you and no accountability to you. All right. Now, the studies on parasocial relationships have mostly focused on the elderly, our own children, and the negative effects have mostly focused on aggression, i.e. the mimicking of aggression, which is actually somewhat contested, and things like body image, because we want to have a similar body image to those who we see in media. As you can tell, though, this reflects the media concerns of the 80s and 90s and the early aughts. Now, when we look at Twitter, we have much more streaming, much more information, much more times to feel like we have a relationship with someone we really don't have a relationship to. And with political figures, this is dangerous. You are much less likely to feel the need to hold a political figure accountable if you think they are an extension of your own identity. Identity, as Adorno said, is the or form of ideology. He didn't say that as an endorsement of something like identity politics, whatever that means. He said it as a way of thinking that, because someone represents you, you identify with them and you will defend them in that representation, whether they represent your interest or not. Because they look like you, because they superficially come from the same class as you, even though they're no longer in that class, because they have a D or an R behind their name, and because you associate that with a bunch of other traits that reflect people like you. This is projection. And this is bad for politics because it means that you are constantly in a confused state where you can sometimes identify through these parasocial interactions so hard with the figure of authority that you assume that you have influence on them just by your will or your mad tweeting or whatever. Furthermore, as a side note, this also is why a lot of fan communities go toxic, because it is impossible to live up to people's projections upon you. And when you have projected upon fictional characters that are made for a commercial basis or upon politicians, you can either make excuses for it, in which case you must become aggressive to outsiders, the people who criticize it, or you will have very negative opinions of it because you feel like it no longer represents you, in which case you become a toxic fandom. Well, politics right now works the same way. In many ways, we have developed so many parasocial relationships with these politicians through things like Twitter, and particularly in COVID, when we are so socially isolated, a lot of us, through our normal means of coping, that what other choice would we have? And this enables us often to make excuses for things we would not normally make excuses for. This is an idol in your head. You do not have a relationship with a politician through Twitter unless you shook that person's hand and gotten an email from them, not from an aide, and know something about them or grew up with them. You do not actually have a relationship. No one represents you one-to-one. If you want someone to represent you, you must be their constituent and must hold them politically accountable. All right? Otherwise, representation is a means of control. And through our projections and our belief that we have relationships to people who would not know us from shit from Shinola, we cannot really address all the issues at hand. This idol is one of the most important ones to smash from your head. You don't have to be a bully about it. You don't have to scream. But you are supposed to realize that you do not have a relationship with a politician. And if you try to defend that, it can get crazier and crazier and crazier, as anyone who follows QAnon conspiracy theories can figure out. This has been Theorizing with a Hammer with Derick Varn. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can check me out on Thursday nights and Pop the Left twice a month. Ben Burgess is also coming back to the channel, so some days you'll see him here as well. And check out This is Revolution on Wednesdays, and make sure to pick up Critical Cuts when you can. And outside of the channel, you can find me on Emancipation Network, or you can see me at the literary magazine Former People at WordPress. And thank you, over and out.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.